Hi, I'm Daisi Jo and I'm a Meningitis Day, and today is World Meningitis Day. So I would love to share with you guys a little bit about meningitis, what it is and how it affects you, my story, and a number of things that you can do just to keep yourself aware, to keep yourself safe, and to help others and spread the news and the message in and around your community. So I got meningitis when I was 26 years old, and oftentimes with meningitis, it's very difficult to detect where it came from, and it's also very difficult to detect as a virus, whether you have viral meningitis or bacterial meningitis. It's very difficult to diagnose, especially if you don't fit into a certain age demographic. So meningitis is common in babies. So it's often tested when a baby is having meningitis symptoms like a high fever, seems to just kind of have like a level of malaise, of disinterest, is not able to turn its neck, or is not very mobile. If the baby is experiencing sepsis, that is definitely an indicator. And so with adults, the symptoms can be very similar. What meningitis is an infection in the brain, in and around the brain, and it causes swelling, and it can also be an infection of the spinal fluid. And that's another way that you can think about it, is an infection of the spinal fluid, and the spinal fluid goes into the brain. And to simplify, because a lot of people have a hard time really thinking about or really understanding an infection of the brain, or an infection of the outside of the brain versus inside the brain. And it's just a very difficult thing to visualize because we actually never see our own brains. And so I try to be as descriptive as possible. So some of the symptoms that you may experience is, again, a high temperature, a temperature that accelerates very quickly out of nowhere. It's not because you did something to cause the headache. You just get a headache, and it's really bad. A meningitis, anyone that's had meningitis will tell you that a meningitis headache is extremely, extremely painful. It's not a headache that you can take a Tylenol and then you'll be fine and get through it at all. It's crippling. It is a crippling headache. So that's one of the first things to keep in mind. Another thing is that you'll have a lot of people have difficulty turning their neck. And what I mean by turning their neck is like this, from the right to the left, or tilting their head back or forward. Your neck becomes very stiff and you're not able to do that. Another symptom is a blurry vision or loss of vision. And you just notice that, like, you can't focus your eyes. Your headache is so intense, and your temperature is so high that everything is just a blur. Another symptom that is actually very, very common along with the temperature and also along with the headache is vomiting. So, and it's uncontrollable vomiting. So it's not like, oh, I don't feel well, my stomach hurts, maybe I have to vomit. Like, you cannot control it. And oftentimes you will experience vomiting and diarrhea at the same time. So if you can imagine having a cluster of these symptoms at the same time, and there's definitely, when that happens, there's definitely an indicator that something is wrong, and it's very difficult to categorize that as something else. So when I had meningitis, I was rushed to an emergency room. A lot of people, unfortunately, are misdiagnosed with meningitis, especially if they're not babies. And I was misdiagnosed twice. And fortunately for me, I had an accident. I had a seizure and I fell. And that's when the hospital had to admit me into the hospital. I was in the ER again for like the third time in 24 hours. And I think if it wasn't for having a seizure because my temperature was so high, I would have died. And because the hospital didn't think that I would have had meningitis, or I would have had any exposure to the virus or the bacteria. And so that is something to keep in mind, is that oftentimes you're misdiagnosed. So tell a lot of people that are at risk, or parents that have small children, get a second opinion, ask again, be forceful if you really feel like something is wrong, because you don't know how long you have. With bacterial meningitis, a lot of times people that are sick, they get sepsis, and that can accelerate very quickly and end in death or loss of limbs, which can be very, very obviously very tragic and very debilitating. So 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 being a meningitis survivor for me, being a meningitis survivor for me, once I was diagnosed with meningitis, I was in the hospital for like 2 weeks. I had to have an IV. I was so dehydrated from vomiting and having diarrhea, and I couldn't eat anything. So I had to have an IV for I don't know, very, very long time, it felt like. And they had to get me well. So I was in the hospital, and I could not work. So it's not something that you can go home and recover and like live your life with. You cannot. So as a 26-year-old, you can imagine that like my life was completely interrupted. And I couldn't hang out with my friends. No one could come to visit me in the hospital. It was until like the very last day, I think the day before I was being released from the hospital, when someone came to see me. And because you're not allowed to have guests, because they were afraid that I would be contagious. So I was quarantined. Now during COVID, I'm sure everyone is very well aware of what being quarantined is like. So I had a very early exposure to having to quarantine myself for like 2 weeks, or until I got better. And then when they released me from the hospital, I lost a lot of weight. So I was barely over, I think I was like 110 pounds or something like that. And so I was very frail. I had to have an IV at home, and I had to have a home nurse. So I could not really walk my dog by myself. I couldn't do many things by myself for a little while. It took about a month. And I really had to adjust my everyday life, because I couldn't stare at a screen, so I couldn't stare at my computer. I couldn't work on my computer because I would get really bad headaches. 3 times a day, I had to take a medication through intravenously. So I had to sit on that intravenous machine, similar to if you've ever been on an IV or something, and they have to get the medication into your body. So I had to sit in an IV for an hour for 3 times a day, so 3 hours a day, and it made me very tired. So after every treatment, I had to take a nap. So then that's 2 hours, for every treatment. And so it didn't leave much time to do anything fun. It took me a long time to recover, to fully recover. And then with meningitis, there's oftentimes a lot of side effects. So I was very lucky because I didn't have any kind of damage to any organs or to any of my limbs. A lot of meningitis patients have damaged their organs, to their limbs. They loss of limb, like I mentioned earlier, and loss of eyesight. Loss of hearing is very common. And I was very fortunate that didn't happen to me. But I did have to go to a infectious disease doctor for a very long time for checkups. I had to go to a neurologist for a while to make sure that I had all my feelings in my fingers and my feet, and that it stayed with me. So I went through a very long time of recovery. Also couldn't eat certain foods anymore. I couldn't drink certain drinks anymore. Like I couldn't drink coffee or tea for quite a while, even though those are 2 of my favorite things. They would just give me a terrible headache, and I would get the jitters, and I couldn't eat anything. The ironic thing is that I couldn't eat anything that I had eaten right before I got sick. And I started vomiting because I would just have a natural regurgitation, and my body just naturally just kind of like rejected it. So obviously it changes your entire life. So I think a lot of the things that people deal with when they are recovering, when they have meningitis, number one, I'm in America, the healthcare system here is very tough, very difficult for many people. It might be better where you are, but it is not necessarily like the best in the world. And I'm saying that as an American person. And so a lot of people end up with a lot of debt, a lot of medical debt. For me, I ended up with a lot of medical debt. I was an entrepreneur at 26 years old. I had a business. I had my own apartment. I had a dog that I took care of. I had a lot of responsibility. I had a car payments, all the life things that an independent 26-year-old has. And then I had this huge medical bill that my insurance was not going to cover all of it. So what I learned through working in the nonprofit industry or nonprofit business of meningitis is that a lot of meningitis people, survivors, they have a lot of bills and they have a lot of expenses they have to take care of. One of the things my insurance didn't cover was a home nurse. So I had to pay out of pocket for a home nurse, and that home nurse had to come see me every day for 2 weeks. And so that gets very, very expensive to pay someone to do that. And you're paying for the medication after a certain point, you're paying for a lot of things that your insurance that are out of network with your insurance here. So I think the financial burden is something that a lot of people struggle with. And some people never recover from it. If you have long-term after effects from meningitis, then you are dealing with the financial burden of whatever those long-term, the costs and expenses of those long-term after effects. So that's something, to keep in mind. I think the scary thing about meningitis is that there's nothing that you can really do to prevent it. It's not a lifestyle. It's not something that you get because you have a certain lifestyle. It's something that you get by chance. So a lot of college students that live in dormitories that share apartments, and then they oftentimes have gotten meningitis. And in the States and in Europe, there are a lot of laws and rules regarding students that live on campus getting the meningitis vaccination, and also small children, newborns, toddlers. It has throughout history been an epidemic. There's been a lot of progress in the field, but in terms of vaccinations, but there's still people every day contracting some form of meningitis, and unexpectedly, and then being left with the responsibility and the burden of taking care of health care, long-term health care in many cases, in terms of long-term after effects of meningitis. So some of the preventative things, that you can do to kind of like protect yourself from meningitis is you can get vaccinated for the meningitis B vaccine, meningitis B. You can get the Men B vaccination, and Sanofi is the producer of the Men B vaccine. And if you have a young person, if you're a school-age person, it's totally worth getting because it just saves you so much risk and exposure, especially if you go to a school that's crowded, if you live in a dorm on the college campus, even if it's not required by the school, it is highly recommended that you get it because the risk of getting meningitis is just not worth not getting it. It's a very good vaccine. The efficacy of the vaccine has been very good and very promising, and it's been on the market for quite a while. So I highly recommend that you get that vaccine. As far as those of you, if you're watching and you've had meningitis and you're struggling with after effects of meningitis, so there's a lot of support groups. So I run a support group for meningitis survivors, and I also run a blog, Meningitis News, to help people with, just disseminating information about meningitis. But as far as diet, I also give advice about diet and self-care and things that you can do. One of the things that I did, which I did before I got meningitis, but I went back to it once I got well, is exercise. I find that exercise has probably been a huge contributor to my recovery. especially when it comes to neural damage. Like one of my sides is weaker. Well, one of your sides is always weaker than the other, but I have coordination issues. Sometimes it's really hard for me to coordinate my left and my right in the way that in the way that I used to be able to. So there's a difference between that and the way that I was before I had meningitis and the way that I am now. Also cognitive function. So I have some cognitive function delays, and if I'm stressed, they are increased. If I'm dealing with a lot of stress, they can be increased. I run temperatures very easily. So anything foreign, like for example, I don't know, like a lot of people had after effects when they got their COVID vaccine, but I ran a very high temperature, and I had like meningitis symptoms like I had the first time. I had the stiff back, stiff neck, all asymptomatic, but they just all were there. Like I just had all those symptoms. And anytime I get sick with the flu or a cold or something, I have all the meningitis symptoms again. So it's like muscle memory in your body. The things that I do to kind of like counteract that, I take a lot of vitamins. I take a multivitamin. I take a magnesium is one of the biggest things that I've learned that helps a lot. I do yoga. I use a sauna a lot. That helps a lot. Using a sauna is actually on my top go-to list of things that I do to help when I'm, just kind of like just off, not really doing that well, getting stiff. Sometimes I'll get some nerve damage, like I'll feel like a nerve agitation in my right leg, and I have to constantly work on that. So I constantly have to do exercises, and I do a lot of coordination exercises or exercise drills. So to just help with my coordination, help with just being able to keep my grip, my hand strength, my arm strength, the same on both sides. And I do a lot of facial exercises, because if you're watching this video, then you probably noticed that my left eye kind of droops a little bit more than my right eye. So I always do eye exercises to help even them out. And when I'm stressed, which these days has been very stressful, it shows a little bit more, and my eye will twitch a lot. So it'll just start twitching away and I have a hard time controlling it. So those are mainly the things. I make sure that I get enough sleep. I try to keep up with my water intake, drink enough water. I may definitely make sure I exercise, and that's how I've, kind of made a full recovery after meningitis. So since we're in the time of COVID, a lot of the questions that I get in my support groups, the support groups that I'm in, is that what are the effects of COVID-19 on meningitis? So to be honest, there's not any data on it. We are taking surveys and asking questions of people and talking to doctors and infectious disease doctors, and just trying to get a filter for what realistically is possible and what isn't. And I think it's just really early to tell. And honestly, for a lot of medical professionals, it is not in the priority, because still the percentage of people with meningitis globally today, especially in developed countries like the United States and throughout Europe and Britain and stuff like that, although there are a lot of people that get meningitis, it's a way lower percentage than obviously COVID right now. And I think that most of the medical profession is really focusing on the COVID impacts on people that have other illnesses like cancer, diabetes, high blood pressure, things like that. That said, people that have had meningitis and they have severe after effects like loss of limb, organ damage, they've had sepsis or something and they've had to lose a limb or something like that, they are probably more at risk, probably. just because there's a lot of side effects and immunity deficiencies that come with having after effects of meningitis. So a lot of people that have lost their limbs, they suffer other illnesses or get colds, sick easily because their body is just always compensating, always trying to compensate. So that's not always the case for everyone, but that's the case. I have seen that in meningitis patients in my group. I think, like I said, there's going to be more data coming out, and maybe we'll be part of surveying people and helping to develop that study and seeing what comes out of it. So I hope that I can come back on and report to you guys with any information and research that we find. One message that I would have for people anywhere in the world, wherever you are, and that if you suffered from a chronic illness, a debilitating illness like meningitis, COVID, cancer, I'm very careful about my words. I want to be very careful about my words because it's not a one fits all. There isn't one thing that fits everyone that, stay positive. It's just very general, right? But you have to find deep down inside of you what is your calling or what is your purpose, or you have to decide. You have to decide on what is your purpose. What do you want your purpose to be? Not what is your purpose that something else abstract has given you, but you have to decide on what you want your purpose to be, and what you want, whatever it is that you're dealing with, whether it's meningitis or something else, what do you want that to mean to you? And what do you want your experience with that chronic illness to mean for other people? So for me, when I got meningitis, I decided at some point that I wanted to crush meningitis, right? And that's a very big dream, but I decided for me that I did not want to be a victim of meningitis. I wanted to be a survivor of meningitis. And not only did I want to be a survivor of meningitis, but I wanted to be on top. And that's when I got involved in advocacy and education and support groups and stuff like that, because I wanted to be on top of meningitis, not meningitis being on top of me or controlling me and controlling my life or what I can do or can achieve. That's a very tall order, but for me, that's what I wanted. I have had other friends, and for them, it has paved ways for them to be in the medical industry. I have a friend who decided that meningitis for her, when she found out she had meningitis very young, when she found out she had meningitis, that her mission was to be in the medical field and to help other people with whatever illness they have. And that has become her mission. And so you have to find out, what does this mean for you? For other people, for me, I wanted me having meningitis and surviving and being on top of meningitis. I wanted other people that had meningitis to see that, and I wanted them to feel empowered to take control too, and to get on top of meningitis too, to beat meningitis and not be a victim of meningitis too. And I wanted to help them do that. I also wanted people to be educated about meningitis, because when I first got meningitis, I didn't know what it was. I had no idea what that was. And there was nothing on Google at that time about meningitis. I couldn't Google it. There was nothing on Wikipedia about meningitis. So I was in the dark. And I was in the dark even after I got out of the hospital, even after I recovered, the information for meningitis wasn't really available for what meningitis was until a few years after I had meningitis. And then for that long, I was only repeating what the doctor had told me. I had meningitis, this is what it is. And all I knew was I had swelling, I had an infection in my brain. And that's all I was telling people because that's all I knew until the wonderful world of the internet, for some reason, expanded on meningitis for me. And a lot of the advocacy groups were online and had websites, and it was information. I could call someone and I could ask them, you know, all the questions that I needed to ask about meningitis. And then I could go back to my doctor and I could ask about these other questions, and I could research and read and find books and find people that could help me. And then in turn, I can help other people. So guys, thank you so much for watching this video, and I hope I have answered all of your questions. I know this has been very long probably for you, but I really wanted to share as much information as I possibly could. It is World Meningitis Day, so I don't want to say happy World Meningitis Day. I think we should be saying be informed on World Meningitis Day. Be empowered on World Meningitis Day, and get vaccinated on World Meningitis Day. Thank you guys. I'm Daisi Jo, and I run Meningitis News, and you can find me on Instagram, and the guys on this feed will tell you how to find me. And if you have any questions, I would be very happy to answer them. Thank you.